Check, check, 1, 2. Check, check, 3, 4. Check, check, 1, 2. Cool. Okay. Good morning and welcome to the stream. I was having some camera issues, so I'm going about this in a somewhat unconventional way, but I think it actually looks okay. Basically, I'm just capturing my desktop without capturing the camera directly into OBS. But that is neither here nor there. In this series, I am reading the IPCC's AR6 summary for policymakers. If you're not sure why I'm doing this, please check out the earlier videos in the series, which explains my impetus for this series. If you're not sure what the IPCC is, the second video of the series explains what that is in more detail, as well as what the AR6 is. So, without further ado, I will get into it. This is the third video in which I have been reading the AR6 summary for policymakers, and this should be the third and final video. So it was split up into 3 parts, A, B, and C, and today I am reading part C. In the previous streams, I read parts A and B. Okay, so part C, responses in the near term. Urgency of near-term integrated climate action. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. There is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. Climate resilient development integrates adaptation and mitigation to advance sustainable development for all and is enabled by increased international cooperation, including improved access to adequate financial resources, particularly for vulnerable regions, sectors, and groups, and inclusive governance and coordinated policies. The choices and actions implemented in this decade will have impacts now and for thousands of years. That is a point that I made in my introduction piece, that everything we do today has extremely long-term ramifications, and that that tends to raise the stakes on things to a point where we are affecting billions or literally trillions of future humans. Evidence of observed adverse impacts and related losses and damages, projected risks, levels, and trends in vulnerability and adaptation limits demonstrate that worldwide climate resilience development action is more urgent than previously assessed in the AR5. Climate resilient development integrates adaptation and greenhouse gas mitigation to advance sustainable development for all. Climate resilient development pathways have been constrained by past development, emissions, and climate change, and are progressively constrained by every increment of warming, in particular beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the longer we wait, the harder it gets to address the issues. Government actions at subnational, national, and international levels with civil society and the private sector play a crucial role in enabling and accelerating shifts in development pathways towards sustainability and climate resilient development. Climate resilient development is enabled when governments, civil society, and the private sector make inclusive development choices that prioritize risk reduction, equity and justice, and when decision-making processes, finance, and action are integrated across governance levels, sectors, and timeframes. Enabling conditions are differentiated by national, regional, and local circumstances and geographies according to capabilities and include political commitment and follow-through, coordinated policies, social and international cooperation, ecosystem stewardship, inclusive governance, knowledge diversity, technological innovation, monitoring and evaluation, and improved access to adequate financial resources, especially for vulnerable regions, sectors, and communities. Continued emissions will further affect all major climate system components, and many changes will be irreversible on centennial to millennial timescales and become larger with increasing global warming. Without urgent, effective, and equitable mitigation and adaptation actions, climate change increasingly threatens ecosystems, biodiversity, and livelihoods, health and well-being of current and future generations. And just to reiterate, that really is the context in which, my frame of reference exists. I call myself a futurist. I think about what future generations will be doing and what actions we take today will impact their ability to thrive. Okay, so we have a graphic here. There is a rapidly narrowing window of opportunity to enable climate resilient development. So we basically have the present world here and 2030, year 2100. So what it's saying is we have these different scenarios, I guess. Early action. Okay, so the blue scenarios, early action and enabling conditions, create future opportunities for climate resilient development. And then in the red scenarios, okay, past conditions. So yeah, basically what we've done in the past impacts what we're able to do at the present and in the future. Makes sense. And then what we do in the near-term future impacts what we can do in the longer-term future. That also makes sense. So there's these shocks, not really sure what those are, but probably like technological innovation. Low emissions. Okay, so this is just listing the things that are happening basically. Conditions that enable individual and collective actions, inclusive governance, diverse knowledge and values, finance and innovation, integration across sectors and timescales. Finance is a big one in the industry, I can tell you that. Ecosystem stewardship, synergies between climate and development actions, behavioral change supported by policy infrastructure, and socio-cultural factors. So yeah, to make a point, it's a combination of action by government, private sector, and society. Society alone cannot do everything to fix climate change because, like, for example, you don't really have a say of where your electricity comes from. For the most part, that requires governmental intervention to enable people to purchase solar power, for example. Conditions that constrain individual and collective actions, poverty, inequity and injustice, economic, institutional, social, and capacity barriers, siloed responses, that's a big one. Lack of finance and barriers to finance and technology, trade-off with SDGs. So siloed responses, like, it doesn't matter how much Germany does. Like, Germany could be 100% renewable. It doesn't really matter because if everybody else doesn't follow suit, then they haven't really solved anything for their people because a ton of CO2 anywhere is a ton of CO2 everywhere. And then the other thing I just want to touch on, because I'm familiar with it in my industry, which is solar, solar pays for itself. It's an incredibly cheap source of energy. So people will say, well, then why do you need finance? Why do you need tax credits? Why do you need incentives? Well, the reason is that, like, think of it this way, if my company it costs like $10 million to build a solar array, and it will make that money back, over its lifespan quite well, honestly, but it might not do it for like 20 or 30 years. It might not hit that, the point where it's just generating profit. So, if we build an array, it'll take us 20 years maybe until we start to see the profit, and then another 10 years to accrue enough profit to construct a second array, right? So what needs to happen is there needs to be massive cash flows up front that can enable more rapid development, because if it's all about like achieving an economy of scale where you have enough profit to reinvest into new facilities. Okay. The benefits of near. Excuse me. I still have a cough. I've had a cough for like months. It's probably. I probably had COVID like 3 months ago. Okay. The benefits of near-term action. Deep, rapid, and sustained mitigation and accelerated implementation of adaptation actions in this decade would reduce projected losses and damages for humans and ecosystems, and deliver many co-benefits, especially for air quality and health. Delayed mitigation and adaptation action would lock in high emissions infrastructure, raise risks of stranded assets and cost escalation, reduce feasibility, and increase losses and damages. Near-term actions involve high upfront investments and potentially disruptive changes that can be lessened by a range of enabling policies. Deep, rapid, and sustained mitigation and accelerated implementation of adaptation actions in this decade would reduce future losses and damages related to climate change for humans and ecosystems. As adaptation options often have long implementation times, accelerated implementation of adaptation in this decade is important to close additional adaptation gaps. Comprehensive, effective, and innovative responses integrating adaptation and mitigation can harness synergies and reduce trade-offs between adaptation and mitigation. Delayed, I wish it would more precisely define those terms. I believe mitigation is deployment of solar energy and adaptation is construction of a seawall, for example. So, if you deploy the solar energy and you reduce the warming, you don't need as high of a seawall because sea level rise is going to be reduced. And what it's saying is like, it doesn't need to be one or the other. You should do both. And, you're finding an optimization that's like a sweet spot between the two cost-wise. Delayed mitigation action will further increase global warming and losses and damages will rise and additional human and natural systems will reach adaptation limits. Challenges from delayed adaptation and mitigation actions include the risk of cost escalation, lock-in of infrastructure, stranded assets, and reduced feasibility and effectiveness of adaptation and mitigation options. Without rapid, deep, and sustained mitigation and accelerated adaptation actions, losses and damages will continue to increase, including projected adverse impacts in Africa, LDCs, SIDS, Central and South America, Asia, and the Arctic, and will disproportionately affect the most vulnerable populations. Accelerated climate action can also provide co-benefits. Many mitigation actions would have benefits for health through lower air pollution, active mobility, like walking and cycling, and shifts to sustainable, healthy diets. Strong, rapid, and sustained reductions in methane emissions can limit near-term warming and improve air quality by reducing global surface ozone. Adaptation can generate multiple additional benefits, such as improving agricultural productivity, innovation, health and well-being, food security, livelihood, and biodiversity conservation. So yeah, beef. If we got rid of our beef farms and traded them for, other forms of crops that are much higher yield per square foot, that would be an example of a co-benefit. There was another one. Oh yeah, the air pollution thing. I touched on this in a previous stream, but yeah, the numbers I keep seeing are like 3 to 5 million people a year die due to toxic pollutants from burning fossil fuels. So like if you burn, it has nothing to do with global warming, nothing to do with climate change. There's just, toxic stuff in coal when you burn it that is it's released into the atmosphere, and people who are downwind of, coal burning facilities breathe it in and get diseases that ultimately kill them. Cost-benefits analysis remains limited in its ability to represent all avoided damages from climate change. The economic benefits for human health from air quality improvement arising from mitigation action can be of the same order of magnitude as mitigation costs and potentially even larger. That means, yeah, that's a good thing. Just another example, like if you have a massive city, like let's just take, New York City. And you have millions of cars, and many of them are burning diesel, whatever, just regular gasoline, doesn't matter. Point is, that's a ton of stuff that's being released into the air. If they were all EVs, that city would be much cleaner. Like, it would literally smell different if every car was an EV. Okay, even without accounting for all the benefits of avoiding potential damages, the global economic and social benefit of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius exceeds the cost of mitigation in most of the assessed literature. More rapid climate change mitigation, with emissions peaking earlier, increases co-benefits and reduces feasibility risks and costs in the long term, but requires higher upfront investments. Yeah, there are so many studies about this. It's like, by limiting global warming, you come out ahead economically. And it's like, there's like, people refer to the social cost of carbon. And the conceptually, it's the case that the cost of the cost to buy and burn a gallon of gasoline is not inclusive of all of the costs to society burning that gallon of gasoline causes. So that is in economic terms, that is kind of what many policymakers are driving at, is trying to figure out, how do we price the actual social cost of using fossil fuels into their price. Ambitious mitigation pathways imply large and sometimes disruptive changes in existing economic structures with significant distributional consequences within and between countries, period. To accelerate climate action, the adverse consequences of these changes can be moderated by fiscal, financial, institutional, and regulatory reforms, and by integrating climate actions with macroeconomic policies through, number one, economy-wide packages consistent with national circumstances, supporting sustainable low-emission growth paths. Number two, climate-resilient safety nets and social protection. And number three, improved access to finance for low-emissions infrastructure and technologies, especially in developing countries. We have another figure. There are multiple opportunities for scaling up climate action. There's a couple different, two different graphics here. The first one, feasibility of climate responses and adaptation and potential of mitigation options in the near term. So, okay. So we have different categories: energy supply, land, water, and food, settlements and infrastructure, health and society, livelihood, and the economy. And then we have different levels of contribution they can make. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but once again, solar coming out really, really looking good. So, potentially feasible up to 1.5. Okay, so these two small columns, on a scale of 1 to 3, it looks like, are they viable? Okay. So confidence level and then feasibility level. So the color is feasibility, the darker is more feasible, and then the confidence level is the dots. Wow. This is a dense infographic. There's a lot to think about here. I'm just going to run through a little bit, but essentially I'm just going to call out the top few in each category. So with energy supply, the best things we can do are switch to solar by far, potential for more than 4 gigatons of CO2 per year. And the colors, okay, I see. The colors are the cost, but it's on a scale of gigatons of CO2 per year. So like very cheaply, we could reduce more than 2.5 gigatons of CO2 per year with solar. It's more expensive if we want to get up to like 4.5. So solar, wind are the top two by far and the cheapest. Reducing methane leaks, I assume is what that is referring to, is another one. So in land, water, and food, reduce conversion of natural ecosystems, so stop destroying natural places. Carbon sequestration in agriculture, okay. And then restore forests, okay. In settlements and infrastructure, more efficient buildings, makes sense. Fuel efficient vehicles and electric vehicles, efficient lighting. And then in society, excuse me, society, livelihood, and the economy, fuel switching, reduce emission of fluorinated gas. Not sure what that is actually. Energy efficiency and material efficiency. So fuel switching, I think, is basically going if you have like a heating oil or like fuel oil, I think is what it's called for like your home heating. If you switch it to natural gas, that's better emissions wise. Okay, the second graphic, potential of demand side mitigation options by 2050. So I guess these are opportunities to reduce demand for emissions, and it's looking like basically food and electricity are the highest two opportunities, and then you have industry. So that's going to be, I think, like a good example would be manufacturing. You can manufacture steel using, a coal-fired power plant or a nuclear power plant or solar or wind with battery storage. Buildings, I think that's going to be mostly building efficiency, insulation, etc. And then land transport, that's obviously, EVs and stuff like that. EVs are in the news so much. Like everybody's always talking about EVs as though they're like the most important thing. And they are, but like all of transportation, I think is only like a third of our emissions. So, the lowest, most impactful hanging fruit for sure is energy production. Getting that solar online and that wind. And the other stuff, geothermal and even nuclear if you want it to be super expensive, but most people want electricity to be cheap. I'm not going to read these. These are just the paragraphs summarizing those infographics. So you can go back and read those yourself if you're interested. Mitigation and adaptation options across systems. Rapid and far-reaching transitions across all sectors and systems are necessary to achieve deep and sustained emissions reductions and secure a livable and sustainable future for all. These system transitions involve a significant upscaling of a wide portfolio of mitigation and adaptation options. Feasible, effective, and low-cost options for mitigation and adaptation are already available, with differences across systems and regions. The systemic change required to achieve rapid and deep emissions reductions and transformative adaptation to climate change is unprecedented in terms of scale, but not necessarily in terms of speed. Systems transitions include development of low or zero emission technologies, reducing and changing demand through infrastructure design and access, socio-cultural and behavioral changes, and increased technology efficiency and adoption, social protection, climate services or other services, and protecting and restoring ecosystems. Feasible, effective, and low-cost options for mitigation and adaptation are already available. The availability, feasibility, and potential of mitigation and adaptation options in the near term differs across systems and regions. Energy systems. Net zero CO2 energy systems entail a substantial reduction in overall fossil fuel use, minimal use of unabated fossil fuels, and use of carbon capture and storage in the remaining fossil fuel systems. Electricity systems that emit no net CO2, widespread electrification, alternative energy carriers in appliances less amenable to electrification, energy conservation and efficiency, and greater integration across the energy system. Large contributions to emissions reductions with costs less than $20 per ton of CO2 equivalent come from solar and wind energy efficiency improvements, and methane emissions reductions. There are feasible adaptation options that support infrastructure resilience, reliable power systems, and efficient water use for existing and new energy systems. Energy generation diversification via wind, solar, and small-scale hydro, and demand-side management, storage, and energy efficiency improvements can increase energy reliability and reduce vulnerabilities to climate change. climate-responsive energy markets, updated design standards on energy assets according to current and projected climate change, smart grid technologies, robust transmission systems, and improved capacity to respond to supply deficits have high feasibility in the medium to long term with mitigation co-benefits. I actually could talk about a bunch of stuff in this paragraph, but I think the thing, I'm just going to point it out. There's a reason that energy systems is the first section in this mitigation section. And there's a reason why it talks about solar and wind first. It's because they are the most viable or the most impactful things that we can do are deploying renewable energy, especially solar and especially wind. Industry and transport. Reducing industry greenhouse gas emissions entails coordinated action through value chains to promote all mitigation options, including demand management, energy and materials efficiency, circular material flows, as well as abatement technologies and transformational changes in production process. In transport, sustainable biofuels, low emissions hydrogen, and derivatives, including ammonia and synthetic fuels, can support mitigation of CO2 emissions from shipping, aviation, and heavy-duty land transport, but require production process improvements and cost reductions. Sustainable biofuels can offer additional mitigation benefits in land-based transport in the short term and medium term. Electric vehicles powered by low GHG emissions electricity have large potential to reduce land-based transport GHG emissions on a life cycle basis. Advances in battery technology could facilitate the electrification of heavy-duty trucks and complement conventional electric rail systems. The environmental footprint of battery production and growing concerns about critical minerals can be addressed by material and supply diversification strategies, energy and material efficiency improvements, and circular material flows. So yeah, once a friend shared with me a bumper sticker on a Prius, I believe, and it said something like 100% coal powered, or it said just coal powered, not 100%. And that's kind of true because in that region, which was in Utah, it's like most electricity comes from coal. So if you plug your, no, it wasn't a Prius. It was a plug-in EV. If you plug your EV into the wall, most of the energy is going to come from, it's coming from the grid. So whatever your local grid is made of. So ours is actually mostly nuclear here in Champaign, Illinois. But other places, it's mostly coal, mostly natural gas, something else. So like an EV is not necessarily clean because it's just taking whatever energy is coming from the grid. That's why it's another reason why it's so important to get the grid extremely renewable so that EVs even matter. Because the other thing about EVs is they take a lot more energy to produce. So that's why it says over the lifetime of the vehicle or on a life cycle basis, what they're saying is when that EV hits the road, it has taken a huge amount of greenhouse gases to bring it into existence. Only after being driven for 5, 6, 7 years is it going to hit the break-even point where it's saved enough gasoline to make up for the emissions cost to manufacture it. And the reason they cost so much more greenhouse gas to manufacture, by the way, is largely because of the batteries, because it takes a lot of diesel fuel to mine lithium and ship it and then manufacture the batteries. Cities, settlements, and infrastructure. Urban systems are critical for achieving deep emissions reductions and advancing climate-resilient developments. Key adaptation and mitigation elements in cities include considering climate change impacts and risks in the design and planning of settlements and infrastructure. Land use planning to achieve compact urban form, co-location of jobs and housing, supporting public transport and active mobility, the efficient design, construction, retrofit, and use of buildings, reducing and changing energy and material consumption, sufficiency, material substitution, and electrification in combination with low emission sources. Urban transitions that offer benefits for mitigation mitigation, adaptation, human health and well-being, ecosystem services, and vulnerability reduction for low-income communities are fostered by inclusive long-term planning that takes an integrated approach to physical, natural, and social infrastructure. Green/natural and blue infrastructure supports carbon uptake and storage, and either singly or when combined with gray infrastructure can reduce energy use and risk from extreme events such as heat waves, flooding, heavy precipitation, and droughts, while generating co-benefits for health, well-being, and livelihoods. In spite of being a civil engineer, I actually know shockingly little about city and infrastructure design for climate resilience. And I should learn more. Land, ocean, food, and water. Many agriculture, forestry, and other land use options provide adaptation and mitigation benefits that could be upscaled in the near term across most regions. Conservation, improved management, and restoration of forests and other ecosystems offer the largest share of economic mitigation potential, with reducing deforestation in tropical regions having the highest total mitigation potential. Ecosystem restoration, reforestation, and afforestation can lead to trade-offs due to competing demands on land. Minimizing trade-offs requires integrated approaches to meet multiple objectives, including food security. Demand-side measures, like shifting to sustainable healthy diets and reducing food loss and food waste, and sustainable agriculture intensification can reduce ecosystem conversion and methane and nitrous oxide emissions, and free up land for reforestation and ecosystem restoration. Sustainably sourced agricultural and forest products, including long-lived wood products, can be used instead of more GHG-intensive products in other sectors. Effective adaptation options include cultivar improvements, agroforestry, community-based adaptation, farm and landscape diversification, and urban agriculture. These AFOLU response options require integration of biophysical, socioeconomic, and other enabling factors. Some options, such as conservation of high carbon ecosystems like peatlands, wetlands, rangelands, mangroves, and forests, deliver immediate benefits, while others, such as restoration of high carbon ecosystems, can take decades to deliver measurable results. So conversion versus restoration takes much longer to restore a mangrove forest than to simply conserve an existing one. Maintaining the resilience of biodiversity and ecosystem services at a global scale depends on effective and equitable conservation of approximately 30% to 50% of Earth's land, freshwater, and ocean areas, including current near natural ecosystems. There is a group that I am intrigued by called, I think it's like Half Earth or something, and their whole goal is to say like half of the surface of Earth should always be natural and not developed, basically. I think that's a really cool idea, and they've arrived at that because they think that that's the amount of natural area that would be necessary to, sustain the sustain the planet and not erode the ecosystems that we depend on. Conservation, protection, and restoration of terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, and ocean ecosystems, together with targeted management to adapt to unavoidable impacts of climate change, reduces the vulnerability and biodiversity of ecosystem services to climate change, reduces coastal erosion and flooding, and could increase carbon uptake and storage if global warming is limited. Rebuilding overexploited or depleted fisheries reduces negative climate change impacts on fisheries and supports food security, biodiversity, human health, and well-being. Land restoration contributes to climate change mitigation and adaptation with synergies via enhanced ecosystem services and with economically positive returns and co-benefits for poverty reduction and improved livelihoods. Cooperation and inclusive decision-making with Indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as recognition of inherent rights of Indigenous people, is integral to successful adaptation and mitigation across forest lands and other ecosystems. Health and nutrition. Human health will benefit from integrated mitigation and adaptation options that mainstream health into food, infrastructure, social protection, and water policies. Effective adaptation options exist to help protect human health and well-being, including strengthening public health programs related to climate-sensitive diseases, increasing health system resilience, improving ecosystem health, improving access to potable water, reducing exposure of water and sanitation systems to flooding, improving surveillance and early warning systems, vaccine development, improving access to mental health care, and heat health action plans that include early warning and response systems, adaptation strategies, which reduce food loss and waste or support balanced, sustainable, healthy diets, contribute to nutrition, health, biodiversity, and other and other environmental benefits. Yeah, flooding of sanitary sewers is a problem and can be dangerous, especially in developing countries. Society, livelihoods, and economies. Policy mixes that include... This cough is so irritating. Maybe someday it'll be over. Policy mixes that include weather and health insurance, social protection and adaptive social safety nets, contingent finance and reserve funds, and universal access to early warning systems combined with effective contingency plans can reduce vulnerability and exposure of human systems. Disaster risk management, early warning systems, climate services, and risk spreading and sharing approaches have broad applicability across sectors. Increasing education, including capacity building, climate literacy, and information provided through climate services and community approaches can facilitate heightened risk perception and accelerate behavioral changes in planning. Climate literacy is a problem. I cannot believe some of the incredibly ignorant stuff that I see on the internet and from politicians. That people do not understand some very fundamental things, like the difference between weather and climate. Synergies and trade-offs with sustainable development. Accelerated and equitable action in mitigation and adapting to climate change impacts is critical to sustainable development. Mitigation and adaptation actions have more synergies than trade-offs with sustainable development goals. Synergies and trade-offs depend on context and scale of implementation. Mitigation efforts embedded within the wider development context can increase the pace, depth, and breadth of emission reductions. Countries at all stages of economic development seek to improve the well-being of people, and their development priorities reflect different starting points and contexts. Different contexts include, but are not limited to, social, economic, environmental, cultural, political circumstances, resource endowment, capabilities, international environment, and prior development. In regions with high dependency on fossil fuels for, among other things, revenue and employment generation, mitigating risk for sustainable development requires policies that promote economic and energy sector diversification and considerations of just transitions principles, processes, and practices. Eradicating extreme poverty, energy poverty, and providing decent living conditions in low-emitting countries and regions in the context of achieving sustainable development objectives in the near term can be achieved without significant global emissions growth. Many mitigation and adaptation actions have multiple synergies with sustainable development goals and sustainable development generally, but some actions can have trade-offs. Potential synergies with SDGs exceed potential trade-offs. Synergies and trade-offs depend on the pace and magnitude of change and the development context, including inequalities with consideration of climate justice. Trade-offs can be evaluated and minimized by giving emphasis to capacity building, finance, governance, technology transfer, investments, development, context-specific, gender-based, and other social equity considerations with meaningful participation of indigenous peoples, local communities, and vulnerable populations. Implementing both mitigation and adaptation actions together and taking trade-offs into account supports co-benefits and synergies for health, human health, and well-being. For example, improved access to clean energy sources and technologies generate health benefits, especially for women and children. Electrification, combined with low GHG energy and shifts to active mobility and public transport, can enhance air quality, health, employment, and can elicit energy security and delivery equity. People tend to live longer in cities, which is, to many, seems counterintuitive because they're like dirty or something. But in reality, people in cities walk a lot more, and walking is actually really good for you. The human body evolved to walk many, many miles every day. And especially in the US, we have designed our cities to be utterly unwalkable. Like if I wanted to get food, I would have to walk miles. I mean, literally miles. It would take me, hours to go get food and come back to the nearest restaurant. And that is just a ridiculous format for a city to have. Prioritizing equity, climate justice, social justice, inclusion, and just transition processes can enable adaptation and ambitious mitigation actions and climate resilient development. Adaptation outcomes are enhanced by increased support to regions and people with the highest vulnerability to climatic hazards. Integrating climate adaptation into social protection programs improves resilience. Many options are available for reducing emission-intensive consumption, including through behavioral and lifestyle changes, with co-benefits for societal well-being. Equity remains a central element in the UN climate regime, notwithstanding shifts in differentiation between states over time and challenges in assessing fair shares. Ambitious mitigation pathways imply large and sometimes disruptive changes in economic structure with significant distributional consequences within and between countries. Distributional consequences within and between countries include shifting of income and employment during the transition from high to low emissions activities. Adaptation and mitigation actions that prioritize equity, social justice, climate justice, rights-based approaches, and inclusivity lead to more sustainable outcomes, reduce trade-offs, support transformative change, and advance climate-resilient development. Redistributive policies across sectors and regions that shield the poor and vulnerable, social safety nets, equity, inclusion, and just transition at all scales can enable deeper societal ambitions and resolve trade-offs with sustainable development goals. To summarize that, what it's really saying is that if we get everybody on board, and if everybody feels like they're being treated fairly in the context of climate mitigation, people will be more likely to support and adopt it. So there's like a sort of tactical political arc to what we do. This is not just like a science industry exercise. Like society must be on board to make the transition work. Attention to equity and broad and meaningful participation of all relevant actors in decision-making at all scales can build social trust, which builds on equitable sharing of benefits and burdens of mitigation that deepen and widen support for transformative changes. Regions and people, 3.3 to 3.6 billion in number, with considerable development constraints, have high vulnerability to climatic hazards. Adaptation outcomes for the most vulnerable within and across countries and regions are enhanced through approaches focusing on equity, inclusivity, and rights-based approaches. Vulnerability is exacerbated by inequity and marginalization linked to, for example, gender, ethnicity, low incomes, informal settlements, disability, age, and historical and ongoing patterns of inequity, such as colonialism, especially for many indigenous peoples and local communities. Integrating climate adaptation into social protection programs, including cash transfers and public work programs, is highly feasible and increases resilience to climate change, especially when supported by basic services and infrastructure. The greatest gains in well-being in urban areas can be achieved by prioritizing access to finance to reduce climate risks for low-income and marginalized communities, including people living in informal settlements. I know a major investment is just literally getting people air conditioners. Yeah. The design of, oh, by the way, heat pump. I should say heat pumps. Getting people heat pumps and also getting them natural gas stoves so they can get away from burning wood and feces to cook their food. The design of regulatory instruments and economic instruments and consumption-based approaches can advance equity. Individuals with high socioeconomic status contribute disproportionately to emissions and have the highest potential for emissions reductions. Many options are available for reducing emissions-intensive consumption while improving societal well-being. Socio-cultural options, behavior, and lifestyle changes supported by policies, infrastructure, and technology can help end users shift to low emissions-intensive consumption with multiple co-benefits. A substantial share of the population in low-emitting countries lack access to modern energy services. Technology development, transfer, capacity building, and financing can support developing countries and regions, leapfrogging or transitioning to low-emissions transport systems, thereby providing multiple co-benefits. Climate-resilient development is advanced when actors work in equitable, just, and inclusive ways to reconcile divergent interests, values, and worldviews toward equitable and just outcomes. So, one key takeaway: the countries that are just developing their infrastructure today, they don't need to build any natural or any fossil fuel power plants. They can shortcut straight to solar because solar is becoming, it's the cheapest source of energy. Governance and policies. Effective climate action is enabled by political commitment, well-aligned multi-level governance, institutional frameworks, laws, policies, and strategies, and enhanced access to finance and technology. Clear goals, coordination across multiple policy domains, and inclusive governance processes facilitate effective climate action. Regulatory and economic instruments can support deep emissions reductions and climate resilience if scaled up and applied widely. Climate resilient development benefits from drawing on diverse knowledge. Effective climate governance enables mitigation and adaptation. Effective governance provides overall direction on setting targets and priorities and mainstreaming climate action across policy domains and levels, based on national circumstances and in the context of international cooperation. It enhances monitoring and evaluation and regulatory certainty, prioritizing inclusive, transparent, and equitable decision-making, and improves access to finance and technology. Effective local, municipal, national, and subnational institutions build consensus for climate action among diverse interests, enable coordination and informed strategy setting, but require adequate institutional capacity. Policy support is influenced by actors in civil society, including businesses, youth, women, labor, media, indigenous peoples, and local communities. Effectiveness is enhanced by political commitment and partnership between different groups in society. Effective multi-level governance for mitigation, adaptation, risk management, and climate-resilient development is enabled by inclusive decision processes that prioritize equity and justice in planning, implementation, allocation of appropriate resources, institutional review, and monitoring and evaluation. Vulnerabilities and climate risks are often reduced through carefully designed and implemented laws, policy, participatory processes, and interventions that address context-specific inequities such as those based on gender, ethnicity, disability, age, location, and income. Regulatory and economic instruments could support deep emissions reductions if scaled up and applied more widely. Scaling up and enhancing the use of regulatory instruments can improve mitigation outcomes in sectoral applications consistent with national circumstances. Where implemented, carbon pricing instruments have incentivized low-cost emissions reduction measures, but have been less effective on their own and at prevailing prices during the assessment period to promote higher cost measures necessary for further reductions. Equity and distributional impacts of such carbon pricing instruments, for example, carbon taxes and emissions trading, can be addressed by using revenue to support low-income households, among other approaches. Removing fossil fuel subsidies would reduce emissions and yield benefits such as improved public revenue, macroeconomic, and sustainability performance. Subsidy removal can have adverse distributional impacts, especially on the most economically vulnerable groups, which in some cases can be mitigated by measures such as redistributing revenue saved, all of which depend on national circumstances. Economy-wide policy packages such as public spending commitments, pricing reforms can meet short-term economic goals while reducing emissions and shifting development pathways towards sustainability. Effective policy packages would be comprehensive, consistent, balanced across objectives, and tailored to national circumstances. I'm not a policy expert, but one thing that I would just bring up is like cap and trade systems are really a good thing because I was talking about the social cost of carbon. Basically what a cap and trade system does is it assigns a social cost to every ton of CO2. And then it gives those out to various corporations based on an analysis of what emissions they require. And says, okay, you have to reduce 5% in the next 5 years or whatever. And what they can do is between one another, they can trade credits for their CO2 reductions. And so what that guarantees is that whatever companies and whatever industrial sectors can cut emissions the most cheaply will do so, and then sell their credits to the industries that it would be very expensive to cut those emissions from. So the effect of that is that society gets the cheapest, absolutely the cheapest form of emissions reductions available. And it's not up to the government to decide oh, I think this would be cheap or that, this would be easy. It's not like a bunch of laws. It's just kind of like free market. You're sophisticated corporations with $1 billion of R&D. You figure out how to reduce your emissions in the best places so that you can get cash for your CO2 reductions by selling the credits. So yeah, cap and trade systems are really a brilliant piece of policy, in my opinion. Drawing on diverse knowledges and cultural values, meaningful participation and inclusive engagement processes, including indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and scientific knowledge, facilitates climate-resilient developments, builds capacity, and allows locally appropriate and socially acceptable solutions. Let's see. Okay, so one last section. Finance, technology, and international cooperation. Finance, technology, and international cooperation are critical enablers for accelerated climate action. If climate goals are to be achieved, both adaptation and mitigation financing would need to increase many-fold. There is sufficient global capital to close the global investment gaps, but there are barriers to redirect capital to climate action. Enhancing technology innovation systems is key to accelerate the widespread adoption of technologies and practices. Enhancing international cooperation is possible through multiple channels. Improved availability of and access to finance would enable accelerated climate action. Addressing needs and gaps and broadening equitable access to domestic and international finance when combined with other supportive actions can act as a catalyst for accelerating adaptation and mitigation and enabling climate-resilient development. If climate goals are to be achieved and to address rising risks and accelerate investments in emissions reductions, both adaptation and mitigation finance would need to increase many-fold. Increasing access to finance can build capacity and address soft limits to adaptation and avert rising risks, especially for developing countries, vulnerable groups, regions, and sectors. Public finance is an important enabler of adaptation and mitigation and can also leverage private finance. Average annual modeled mitigation investment requirements for 2020 to 2030 in scenarios that limit warming to 2 or 1.5 degrees Celsius are a factor of 3 to 6 greater than current levels. And total mitigation investments, public, private, domestic, and international, would need to increase across all sectors and regions. Even if extensive global mitigation efforts are implemented, there will be need for financial, technical, and human resources for adaptation. There is sufficient global capital and liquidity to close global investment gaps given the size of the global financial system, but there are barriers to redirect capital to climate action both within and outside the global financial sector and in the context of economic vulnerabilities and indebtedness facing developing countries. Reducing financing barriers for scaling up financial flows would require clear signaling and support by governments, including a stronger alignment of public finances in order to lower real and perceived regulatory costs and market barriers and risks, and improving the risk-return profile of investments. At the same time, depending on national contexts, financial actors, including investors, financial intermediaries, central banks, and financial regulators, can shift the systemic underpricing of climate-related risks and reduce sectoral and regional mismatches between available capital and investment needs. Tracked financial flows fall short of the levels needed for adaptation and to achieve mitigation goals across all sectors and regions. These gaps create many opportunities, and the challenge of closing gaps is largest in developing countries. Accelerated financial support for developing countries from developed countries and other sources is a critical enabler to enhance adaptation and mitigation actions and address any inequities in access to finance, including its costs, terms and conditions, and economic vulnerability to climate change for developing countries. Scaled up public grants for mitigation and adaptation funding for vulnerable regions, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, would be cost-effective and have high social returns in terms of access to basic energy. Options for scaling up mitigation in developing countries include increased levels of public finance and publicly mobilized private finance flows from developed to developing countries in the context of the $100 billion a year US dollars goal. Increased use of public guarantees to reduce risks and leverage private flows at lower cost, local capital markets development, and building greater trust in international cooperation processes. A coordinated effort to make the post-pandemic recovery sustainable over the long term can accelerate climate action, including in developing regions and countries facing high debt costs, debt distress, and macroeconomic uncertainty. Enhancing technology innovation systems can provide opportunities to lower emissions growth, create social and environmental co-benefits, and achieve other SDGs. Policy packages tailored to national contexts and technological characteristics have been effective in supporting low-emission innovation and technology diffusion. Public policies can support training and R&D, complemented by both regulatory and market-based instruments that create incentives and market opportunities. Technological innovation can have trade-offs such as new and greater environmental impacts, social inequalities, overdependence on foreign knowledge and providers, and distributional impacts and rebound effects, requiring appropriate governance and policies to enhance potential and reduce trade-offs. Innovation and adoption of low-emission technologies lags in most developing countries, particularly least developed ones, due in part to weaker enabling conditions, including limited finance, technology development and transfer, and capacity building. International cooperation is a critical enabler for achieving ambitious climate change mitigation, adaptation, and climate-resilient development. Climate-resilient development is enabled by increased international cooperation, including mobilizing and enhancing access to finance, particularly for developing countries, vulnerable regions, sectors, and groups, and aligning finance flows for climate action to be consistent with ambition levels and funding needs. Enhancing international cooperation on finance, technology, and capacity building can enable greater ambition and can act as a catalyst for accelerating mitigation and adaptation, and shifting development pathways towards sustainability. This includes support to NDCs and accelerating technology development and deployment. Transnational partnership can stimulate policy development, technology diffusion, adaptation, and mitigation, though uncertainties remain over their costs, feasibility, and effectiveness. International environmental and sectoral agreements, institutions, and initiatives are helping, and in some cases may help, to stimulate low GHG emissions investments and reduce emissions. And that's it. No conclusion paragraph. So, okay, so this is the end of this particular streaming series. I have read to you the synthesis report of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, AR6, Summary for Policymakers. So, in retrospect, I kind of wish that I had read the longer report because I feel like what this report is like, here's what we know, but it didn't dive quite as deeply as I had hoped into the here's how we know it. So, it makes statements like, well, without a specific example, like climate, it makes statements like the earth is warming, right? So, but it didn't really explain like how we know that. Like, I don't think I read anything about, like satellite temperature records, which are a really big deal. And I would have liked to know about that. I would have liked to hear about CO2 concentration in ice cores. I would have liked to hear more about like volcanism and how that impacts global temperature and why we know that we cannot explain the recent warming by virtue of a lack of volcanism. Stuff like that. That I'm really more interested in the sort of earth sciences type stuff. I know a lot about climate from the perspective of energy and industry, but I really don't know a ton about climate system science and geoengineering and stuff like that. So I wish it had talked more about that. I suspect that is in the longer report. I will seriously consider making another series in which I read the longer report. However, it's like 80 something pages, and this 36 page series took quite a bit of bandwidth to get through. So yeah, I may or may not do that. Thank you for bearing with me and listening to my cough. I don't think I have anything else to add here. So, if you watched, I hope you learned something. I hope that you have broadened your understanding of climate and our humanity's current understanding of it and what we need to do. I am always here to engage on the subject through YouTube comments, email, whatever media you see fit. Always up for discussion. Whether or not you enjoyed, whether or not you learned something, I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, or night.